Martin, let's just begin talking a little bit about the news that's come out from the UK today. Tell me a little bit about what's been happening in the UK.
Well, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, has resolved to measure the well-being of the British population, but most importantly, to hold himself accountable for public policy by changes in well-being. It's a bold thing for him to do, particularly in the midst of draconian economic circumstances. When Cameron first took on doing this, the critics he ran into said, well, you're going to impoverish us, so you're turning to something like well-being. Well, particularly at the low level of wealth, well-being and wealth go in lockstep. So Cameron has not stacked the deck in his favor, and there is a fair chance that he may find that national well-being goes on. So my view is that David Cameron has done something really quite brave that in the short term may not help him, but in the long term seems like a very good way of judging sound government.
Now in South Australia we are beginning to talk about some of the same proposition. Can you talk to me a bit about what kinds of things we've talked about, both the measuring of it and the teaching of it?
Well, I think in South Australia we're very concerned about young people. And of course young people are our future. And so the first step for me is to measure the well-being of every young person in South Australia. And that's low-hanging fruit. Starting at age 9, we know how to do that, and we merely have to graft some of the good instruments of well-being for teenage onto what's already measured in Australia. In the long run, we'll be able to measure the well-being of little kids as well. But that will be a big project, and South Australia may be the pioneer for that. Once we measure the well-being of every young person in South Australia, we can ask the question, well, can you increase it? And there are courses taught in schools, the teaching of teachers, in which there's good reason to think when teachers learn the techniques of well-being that the depression and anxiety in their students goes down over the next couple of years, and their life satisfaction goes up. So part two, what I think South Australia can do is to institute teaching programs in schools and in the mental health penumbra around schools for young people.
That set of ideas, both the measuring of the well-being and then teaching a whole cohort of people to teach it, that could actually create a large-scale impact in a state. Do you think that's feasible?
Yes, and very interesting material on contagion. So we're quite interested in the contagion of obesity, of depression, and so we measure actually if person 1 is obese, what's the probability that person 2 who lives next door will be obese? So you can actually put a number on contagion. So it turns out happiness is more contagious than sadness. And so I think that's quite important, that if you will, a critical mass of young people and teachers and communities are invested in well-being, there is reason to think there may be an upward spiral.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that contagion idea?
From the first day I took up downhill skiing till 5 years later when I gave it up, I was always fighting the mountain. And as a therapist and as people who work on obesity and dieting find, we're always fighting the mountain. And the way we measure the effects of traditional psychotherapy and the effects of dieting is how long it lasts before it melts to zero. And that's an unfortunate thing about remedial programs. But interestingly, when you work on well-being, the exercises that work in the short term seem to be self-maintaining. So if I say, Gabe, your highest strength seems to be kindness, can you use kindness more at work? And once people start doing that, other people like them better, work goes more easily. So many of the exercises in well-being maintain themselves, whereas exercises in which you deprive yourself of chocolate, your favorite food in the world, end after about a month.
Martin, talk to me a bit about strengths and the work you've done on strengths and why, if people operate from their strengths, they increase their well-being.
Well, we're very interested in when people go into flow, when time stops for them, when learning is at its best, when they're completely absorbed in what they're doing. And it turns out we know something about that. It's when people's highest strengths are just matched to the challenges that come their way. So if you want an effective school system in which kids are engaged, you first need to identify their highest strengths. And so there is a well-validated questionnaire for children and adults on what your highest strengths are. And the object is to find out your highest strengths, kindness, gratitude, fairness, and then to build your life around them and let those highest strengths meet the difficulties that come your way.
So you focus not so much on fixing the broken bits, but more on going with the things that you're good at. Is that the idea?
Fixing the broken bits is important, and I spent 35 years of my life fixing the most broken bits I could find: suicide, post-traumatic stress disorder, and depression. But the problem about the broken bits is once the person falls off a cliff and you summon the ambulance, there isn't much you can do. You've got minimal leeways once it's broken, but you have huge effects preventatively. So in fact, the history of medicine, the history of public health, is not a history of cure. It's a history of prevention. So by applying the very same logic to the mental health of the children of South Australia, we certainly want to keep treating the kids who have been abused, who are in depression, who try suicide. I'm all for that. I've spent my life doing that. But in addition, we're likely to have much more leverage by arming kids in advance with the skills of resilience and positive psychology. The evidence in 21 replications is that children who first learn the resilience skills as they go through puberty have less depression and less anxiety.
Ah, so this is the psychological immunization idea that you've been talking about.
Yes, one of my most inspiring moments was a conversation with Jonas Salk when he was an old man, and we were talking about the development of the Salk vaccine. And I asked him what he would do now if he were a young person, and he said, well, he would do immunization again, but he'd do it psychologically rather than biologically. And indeed, that is very much the endeavor that now becomes possible for South Australia.
Martin, why did you accept the invitation to come here and do this work in South Australia?
Well, I must confess I'm an opportunist. And so a couple of years ago, I waved the banner that 51% of the world's adults should be flourishing by 2051 by positive psychology criteria. And I had done something like that on a small scale in schools and even in the United States Army. And so the opportunistic part of me was asking, what's the next step? Well, the next step is a political unit, the state. And then Thinkers in Residence and the Premier of South Australia came along and invited me to come to South Australia. I had no idea what would happen, but it became clear within the first few days that the Premier had a platform for child well-being, and that fit exactly into the Jonas Salk model. So being in South Australia has opened my eyes to the real possibility that a political unit, a state, could become the Florence of well-being for the world.
I've heard you talk about what you've learned and researched about is on the individual level, but that's not the same as bringing these ideas to scale. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yes, I think the traditional model for increasing the mental health of people has been a one-to-one therapy interaction. Well, even though I was president of the largest union of therapists in the world, the American Psychological Association, that's an impossible model for a state. So what's needed is for well-being to be on the political agenda, and more importantly, to be in the warp and woof of a community, that a community is about increasing the well-being of the individuals in it. And what being in South Australia opens the question of how do you go from individual well-being, which we now know how to measure, and even something about how to build. So how do you do this for an entire community or an entire state?
So what kinds of things have you talked about during the residency? What are the ideas that have been kicked around?
Well, there have been several very rich ideas, and by the way, they're not rich in the sense of being very expensive. So we've talked about teacher training, And can we bring the tools of well-being into normal teacher training for all the teachers in South Australia? Similarly for mental health. Traditionally, we teach social workers and psychologists about the 350 kinds of ways of being crazy. But there are quite a few ways of being sane, and they're teachable. And so the notion that positive health, positive psychology should become part of the training for our mental health workers. So teachers and mental health workers become two fulcra for the teaching of well-being. And one of the most intriguing ideas I've heard is something that is labeled the permacore. And that's the notion that in the gap year, that Adelaide and South Australia would support gap years in which 19-year-olds worked on more positive emotion in their community, more engagement, better relationships, more meaning. And I think that's an intriguing idea about how to move from individual well-being to the well-being of a state. And there's one more society-wide thing that could happen. There are parent training programs for well-being, and in fact, we found in quite extensive research that when parents learn the skills of well-being and teachers learn the skills of well-being, and they both teach it to children, that the children do better.
Are there any other conversations going on about how to change a whole society?
Yes, so there's very good evidence that teaching the skills of positive psychology to teachers works, and it works in a very special way. And in many ways, the Army tells us this. So we've now trained 8,000 drill sergeants in well-being and how to teach well-being. And what we find, the drill sergeants are very critical, and they sort of sit there on the first day, and what is this stuff they're going to try to shove down my throat, girly, touchy-feely psychobabble. And by the end of the first day, they're fully engaged, and by the end of the 9th day, 70% of them volunteer to come back to become trainer of trainers. When we teach teachers, we find the same effect. This is the best course I've had in teacher education, but most importantly, it rejuvenates teachers. And I don't know what the mechanism of good teaching really is, but I think it involves zest, liveliness, and rejuvenation on the part of teachers. And that part we're certain of, that the teaching of the techniques of well-being to teachers rejuvenates teachers. I think it reminds teachers why they went into it in the first place. So having been a teacher for 45 years, much of the time I'm thinking about all the things my students aren't doing, all the hassles I'm having with my administrators. But when I focus on the fact that I'm building life-changing things into my students, that's why I went into teaching, and it reminds me of why I became a teacher.
You've told me that one of the ideas you're working on is prospecting into the future. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Well, when I first started to work on positive psychology, if you will, the error that I was working on was that psychology for 120 years had only worked on the negative side of life. So I thought, well, it would be eye-opening to work on what makes life worth living. But when I started to work on it, I found that there was a deeper mistake that psychology had made, and that was to think of people as prisoners of the past. And the notion of habit, the notion of childhood experience, all of 19th century great intellects, Freud, Marx, Darwin, were all about being prisoners of the past. But if you think about what you're doing right now, you're prospecting into the future. You're saying to yourself, well, if Dr. Seligman is right, maybe I should be teaching my kids about well-being. You're doing if X, then Y. Well, I think the frontal lobes are not prisoners of the past. They're planning the future. They're constantly going, if X, then Y, and evaluating it. So one of the major things I'm up to these days is, what is if X, then Y about? How can we make kids more imaginative? What's going on in the brain when people do if X, then Y? So part of breaking the chains of being prisoners of the past is to have a serious science and pedagogy of imagination.
I can imagine that that would have a really big impact on a whole society's ability to innovate. What do you think about that?
Yes, so, you know, for 50 years there have been courses on creativity, brainstorming, and I think they amount to virtually zero. And I think it's partly because the question has not been conceived well. So I think the question really is the if X then Y question. And as far as I know, no one has systematically asked, how do we do if X then Y? How do we enrich it? How do we make it more concrete? How do we get better at evaluating the possibilities? And kind of the best that psychology has done so far is to talk about the things we do wrong, about what's called negative heuristics. But correcting all the things we do wrong is not equal to getting it right. So the question is, what are the positive heuristics? How do we get if X then Y right? And so my hope is that people in this field, and I think it will be a new field called prospecting, may be able to enrich our imagination. And it follows directly from that, that this precious thing that human beings have, which animals don't have, innovation, may follow.
You've also talked to us about the incredible achievements of people over the last hundreds of years, the progress of society. It really fits into that, doesn't it?
Well, I think it's, on almost any variable I know, things are better than they were 500 years ago. You're at 1/30th the likelihood of having a violent death now than you were 500 years ago, and that's just one of numerous statistics. Human progress is undeniable. Now, the reason this is important is that we want our young people to have a vision of possible positive human futures. And to the extent history is taught as one damn thing after another, and literature is taught as one tragedy after another, we put the scales back on the eyes of our young people. So one of my interests is, can we teach history and literature, have films, have journalism, which opens people's eyes to a positive human future?
This really sounds like you're not just talking about a whole new approach in health, but that there are a whole lot of other academic areas and areas of learning that could really be affected by this notion of positive psychology. This is a pretty big project.
Well, I don't know if there will be a positive human future. I mean, I do look at economic projections and naysaying, and it really may be true. I have no way of knowing. But if there is to be a positive human future, we have to know how to measure it and how to build it, and we have to have people envision it. So I think underneath much of what positive psychology does, it asks, how can we encourage, how can we produce the undergirding of people having a positive vision of the best that human beings can do?